Too many people around here been dropping like flies already, and where's that getting us, huh? Nowhere. Fast. You know what old Jack Burton always says at a time like this? Who? Jack Burton. Me.
I'm going to tell y'all right now, all of these wonderful people would not be here without Patreon supporters like you. If you enjoy credible news, reviews, and commentary on UFOs and UAPs 5 days a week, you want to support this show. What's your name? Marty. Marty, look how easy this is, Marty. Pick up your phone. Boom! You're a Patreon member. I mean, look, it's so easy. You just click the link, which is right here. Just for $1 a month, you can support this show. Just fill out the information and pledge what's comfortable for you. It could be $1, $5, $10, or who knows. Just support.
Hello, and welcome to another week at the Unidentified Celebrity Review. We have a great interview lined up today. The expert on Black Triangle UFOs, among other mysterious things, is joining us. It's going to be an interesting discussion. You know, I find it incredibly interesting that there seem to be distinct buckets of UFO sightings. Black triangles, tic-tacs, orbs, flying saucers. The list goes on and on. And forming these classifications can be extremely useful in correlating data and coming up with conclusions. But there is danger in being too rigid in one's classifications. Could a black triangle craft appear as an orb in certain circumstances? Could these be different observations by different perspectives of the same thing? Focusing too narrowly may cause you to miss the forest from the trees. So I think it's important to classify data, but to also realize that at some levels, classifications are arbitrary, and lines can be blurred. Just as UFO observations might not fit nicely into a predefined category, most humans aren't completely contained in a category like skeptic or believer. Most of us find ourselves skirting between the boundaries of these classifications in different circumstances. You know, even the distinction of what is alive versus unalive is arbitrary. Scientists say that bacteria is life, but viruses are not life. At a high enough perspective, all of biological life is just complex chemistry. So who is to say that the chemical processes that make us up are any more complex or relevant than those that drive our sun? So sure, classifications are useful, but it's important to keep the boundaries permeable and the mind open. Who knows? Perhaps someday we'll be able to move some items from the unidentified category to the identified. And hopefully discussions like the one we'll be having today will help us inch towards that reclassification. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. Unfortunately, UFO Jane can't make it today, but as always, please join me in welcoming the creator of the madness that is UCR, Luis Jimenez.
Hey, Rather, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great. Really looking forward to this interview today.
Great monologue, by the way, man. You always, that's why I love you on this show, man. You're always getting people to think in different ways, and I truly appreciate it. And what I also appreciate is everybody's love in the chat over here. Truly, truly appreciate it. Before we get to that, hello, good morning, good evening, good day, good afternoon, and aloha. Welcome back to another episode of the Unidentified Celebrity Review. Your home for credible news, reviews, and commentary on everything UAP and UFO. My name is Luis Jimenez. As always, with me, Mr. Rather Be Squidding, co-hosting, being my Chewbacca. Although now you're Chewbacca, now I'm Han Solo. There we go. That's better. Before we bring on our guests, I want to pay some bills. Of course, I want to say thank you to DOS Tapes. They provide all the tunes you hear on the show. Their Bandcamp is in the description below. I want to say thank you to the moderators and everybody in the chat. Mwah, you are the best out there. We are a public access channel. We're supported by viewers like you, so check out the Patreon, which starts at $1 a month, and of course, Super Chats if you've got a dying question that absolutely must be answered. Consider Super Chats a great way to support the show. And let's see what else. I want to say check out the links below. We've got links for the guests and, of course, our hosts right in the description below right here. So if you want to follow their work, it's only a click away. So check that out. Well, this is going to be a good one, rather. I think we've got, like you said, the #1 expert on triangle craft and UFOs, Mr. David Marler. He's also, the bio is extensive on David Marler, but there's a couple of things that stuck out to me, other than his lifelong interest in UFOs, and he's investigated and researched it for 30 years. He joined the MUFON network, the Mutual UFO. I can't read today. The Mutual UFO Network in 1990 as a field investigator trainee, and since then he served as field investigator, state section director, as well as Illinois state director. David is an internationally recognized independent UFO researcher. One of the things that really stuck out in his bio to me is David strives to have an open mind regarding the UFO phenomenon. However, he also acknowledges the need for a skeptical approach when examining each individual UFO report. Despite the large percentage of misidentifications and hoaxes in the UFO data, David recognizes what appears to be a core phenomenon beneath it all. His pragmatic approach focuses on the information and data associated with cases, and he ignores the pitfalls of belief as well as the ubiquitous conspiracy theories polluting the subject matter. So without further ado, the one, the only Mr. David Marler. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. It's great to be with both of you, and rather a great lead-in. I love the monologue.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
He's got a great channel, by the way. You guys should check it out. Rather Be Squidding. It's on YouTube. The link's in the description below. It's always fun. Rather Show's always fun. Okay, so David, gosh, where do we start with you? Because you are a man of all trades here, and you do a lot of different things. Obviously, I think the main reason why we're having you on for a discussion is your expertise in UFOs, and particularly triangle crafts. When I was messaging you an email, the first thing, I don't know if you've seen the Showtime documentary series UFO.
I've heard a lot of reviews about it. I've talked to people who have seen it. I have not seen it though.
Okay. Man, I'd love to get your opinion on it. But there was a part within that documentary where former MUFON, I believe he was a director, please remind me.
James Carrion, right?
James Carrion was on the documentary, and he was talking about, of course, James has completely done a 180 on as far as his beliefs and sort of thoughts on this phenomenon. But he brought up this idea of top secret hypersonic balloons that are particularly shaped like triangles. And then they also had an expert on, I'm forgetting his name, but he was discussing this idea that the United States military has the high altitude supersonic balloon systems that can move up to Mach 6 and that are massive. Have you heard of any of this kind of technology?
No, and I have some reservations right out of the gate. I think any aerospace engineer that's maybe listening to the show would concede that if you're going to have a high velocity aircraft, you have to have the structural integrity to withstand the G-force. And a lighter than air frame, as we all know, whether it's a Goodyear blimp or any other type of dirigible, simply doesn't have that structural integrity to sustain the G-force, and not just G-force, just the atmospheric pressure, the atmospheric pressure being exerted on it. Now, many people historically have looked at some of these triangle cases and said, well, it might be a dirigible. Now, we can't paint with a broad brush. We can't say they're all anomalous. We can't say they're all prosaic. You have to really, the devil's in the details, as we like to say. Right. Some of these triangles, and in fact, there's one I'm hoping I can update you and the audience on some research I literally just finished up this weekend. I've been working on for a year now. Haven't talked about it publicly, but in the course of that, there was a case that I wrote about in my book back in 2013 of a triangle that was sighted over California. The news accounts that I had come across at the time speculated it might have been a balloon because it was just simply drifting overhead. And lo and behold, going through this new data set that I've recently acquired, I found a subsequent news article that demonstrated and proved it was in fact a balloon. There was actually a press photographer that snapped a picture of it after the police had grabbed it and had tethered it down, but then it broke free again. But they were able to take a picture, and it was a black triangle, but it was relatively small in size. And it's one of those that we would write off as an IFO, identified flying object. So that's just one example I came across fairly recently, where here we think it might be anomalous and it turned out not to be. But the idea of a high velocity balloon or dirigible, I just have fundamental issues with that. And I would argue that if they're putting forth that, where are they drawing that from? Do they have any factual evidence to support the existence? Because there's also the TR-3B, which has become an urban myth within UFO circles and on the internet. And I challenge anyone to prove me wrong. Is there any official documentation? And the key word there is official. I'm not interested in anecdotal data circulating on the internet. To my knowledge, and in conversations with Chris Mellon and others that I know that I still keep in contact with, there's no factual evidence for the existence of a TR-3B. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but the burden of proof is on the person making the claim.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious about that 2013 California case. Was that a hoax, or was there any reason for them having a triangle balloon there?
Which ones? Oh, the one from the 60s?
Or for the 2013 that you said that they it was confirmed that it was a balloon. Maybe I misheard that. But
was there? My book was from 2013. The case was from the 1960s.
Yeah. Oh, right on. Was that a hoax, or was there a legitimate reason for them having a balloon like that?
I believe it was some type of weather or atmospheric balloon that had actually descended and was moving low, and witnesses had observed it. But I have in my new lecture that I'm going to be presenting in 2022, I have pictures of the police officers that have part of the balloon, and then the picture that the photographer took of this triangular shape drifting over a hillside. And it's just one of those that, we don't want to read UFO into everything. I mean, certainly we try to find a prosaic explanation. That being said, that's the exception, not the rule. The rule is, and my research I've been conducting over the course of the last year, I just concluded and reviewed all of the historic NICAP and CUFOS UFO case files from 1947 until 1977. And there's a reason I stopped at 77, which I'll touch on. I found 102 triangular UFO reports going through those files. And one of the reasons I did this, obviously, was just to see the patterns that I outlined in my book in 2013 were based on the data that I had available at the time. Then on election day, November 3rd, 2020, I had the moving van show up in front of my home. They unloaded 15 4- and 5-drawer file cabinets filled with the largest historical collection of UFO case files. And that was courtesy of Dr. Mark Rodiger with the Center for UFO Studies. I've taken over as their archivist, and I'm now on the board of CUFOS. But literally sitting off camera right here, I have Dr. J. Allen Hynek's original Project Blue Book material, as well as NICAP, CSI New York, not the TV show, but an early civilian UFO organization. And we have literally 75 years worth of historical UFO data here. And so obviously, based on the research I did at the time, I wanted to go through systematically all of those files and look for any potential triangular UFO cases. Many of the cases that I found described just 3 lights, no object that could be seen. I threw that out, just like I did in my book. 3 lights may be just that, 3 separate illuminated objects moving in a triangular formation. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the structured vehicles, cases where, like a case from 1969 in Indianapolis, the witness described a silver triangular object with a light at each point, brilliant illumination at each point, that was reflecting the street lights from the ground on the underside of this thing.
Wow.
So it's not that the person's simply reading into 3 points of light and seeing a triangle. Admittedly, skeptics, if they were on the show right now, would say, well, we're a pattern-seeking creature and we try to fill in the blanks. I agree. And so that's why I didn't take any just 3 points of light, nor did I take any V formations of lights. They could be just that, an echelon formation of individual objects or lights. But it's the structured vehicles, the low altitude vehicles, the ones where there's detail in many cases described. And, rather to your monologue, I loved what you said, because one of the characteristics I outlined in 2013, which I found exemplified in some of these new old cases, if I can call them that, are triangles that seem to morph or change. There was a case that I've written about and I've lectured about, and Smithsonian Channel did a documentary where they recreated this, where a pilot was over Albany, Georgia in 1953. And this is in Project Blue Book files. And in the report, it states that initially the pilot saw a perfectly circular light, which caught his attention because it wasn't scintillating like a star or a planet. It had a very sharp outline. The report in Blue Book states the pilot then stated it would alternate orange, white, and it cycled that 3 or 4 times. Then, as he's observing the light, it changed into a red triangle, which then divided into 2 triangles, one hovering above the other. And that's an actual report from Project Blue Book, an early one at that, 1953.
Was that one of the unsolved ones? Was that sort of in that unsolved category of?
It's funny you asked that, Luis, because the official Blue Book explanation for the sighting, they delineate the sighting from radar confirmation, which, by the way, they did have in this case. They said that the sighting was attributed to the planet Venus, which is interesting because when the pilot first saw the light, his first impression was maybe it is just a planet or a star. So he increased altitude on his jet fighter. Within a matter of seconds, he realized that the light that was above him was now beneath his aircraft. So Venus is a rather interesting explanation in that case. And then, of course, with the morphing and then dividing into 2, it's very interesting. But the Albany, Georgia airport did confirm a primary radar target at the same location and time of the sighting. And I believe on the Blue Book report, the radar aspect is still listed as unidentified.
What did Dr. Hynek think about that case?
I don't have anything specific on that case, but you bring up an excellent point. Admittedly, the Blue Book files are out there within the public domain, but what we have here are Hynek's personal files. And what's interesting is it really gives you insight into the man and into his thinking, because, Luis, to your point, there are some of these that would have an explanation ball lightning. And Dr. Hynek would take a red felt pen, is usually what he wrote with, and he would cross that out. He crossed it out 3 times. Underneath that explanation, he wrote unidentified in uppercase letters and underlined it 3 times. And in some of the other reports that you can go through, and there's a plethora of reports here, you'll find that he would quite often have interesting comments. He would state, why didn't, and typically he would refer to Air Force in his notes as AF. Why didn't AF investigators obtain radar in this case? Why didn't AF investigators interview the additional witnesses? And some of these are actually from the mid-1950s. So even in the 50s, Dr. Hynek, based on his own notes and observations, you could see he was kind of at odds with the official explanations that they were trying to put forth at the time. And then, as we know, over the years, that skepticism continued to erode over time.
So based off of your, especially the sort of the narrow view that Hynek had put aside and really was interested in, what do you take away from reading all of his notes? I mean, what, to your best summation, do you think he thought we were dealing with?
Well, I think as a good scientist, he wouldn't label what it is, rather what it isn't, and that's how I try to approach it as well. We try to find those conventional explanations. As I'm sure on many of your episodes you've discussed, are we dealing with extraterrestrials? Are we dealing with all conventional explanations? Are we dealing with time travelers, ultra-dimensional travelers? Is it all the above? Yeah. Your guess is as good as mine, but as you were mentioning, Luis, in the introduction, I'm really not interested in belief systems, and that includes my own. My attitude is, let's look at the data that exists. And I say this because I'm going to be mentioning this in my lecture this year. 2022, this is the 75th anniversary of the modern age of UFOs. This is the year. 75 years ago, this June, was when Kenneth Arnold had his famous sighting where the term flying saucer was coined. And what's interesting about that is, here we are on the 75th anniversary of the modern UFO era. And what's interesting is we see a lot of new players coming into the UAP fray, right, since the Pentagon UFO report. One of the most notable is Dr. Avi Loeb from Harvard. And what's interesting is Dr. Loeb and others have stated that we're going to look at the UFO subject or UAP subject scientifically, but we're only going to look at things moving forward. We're not going to look at history.
Right.
And I think that's a huge disservice. I think that's somewhat short-sighted in the approach because, again, I just myself, not speaking on behalf of other historians and UFO researchers, I have 30 file cabinets of material, and that's just the file cabinets. That's not the historic audio recordings like I've been digitizing.
Wow.
The reels. I just digitized 221 recordings over the course of this past year while working on my triangle research as well.
Wow.
There's a wealth of information out there. Now, admittedly, I will be the first to tell you, you go through these file cabinets, I would estimate 80 to 90% could be explained in conventional terms. In other words, someone described something that looked like a fireball. It moved like a fireball. Well, then it probably was a fireball. We don't need to find some exotic explanation for it. Many meteor reports, many fireball reports, military aircraft reports, you name it, balloons, certainly, weather balloons and high altitude research balloons. There was a famous triangle case, actually, one of the most popular triangle cases from Madrid, Spain in 1968. And that one garnered a lot of media attention. And I have an extensive file here on this. But this one turned out to be a French atmospheric meteorological balloon. And I even have in the files, and I think I even have it right here with me, NICAP received a letter signed by the director of the meteorology department in Spain. And this is the letter right there. Signed by the director himself, stating that based on their research, it did turn out to be a meteorological balloon that was deployed from France. So there was even a picture taken of it, which is interesting. But very popular. A lot of people got excited, but sorry, there was a conventional explanation in that case.
Yeah. Go ahead.
How would you compare the Project Blue Book to the new stuff coming now, the new offices that are being created by the DoD? There's a common criticism that this is just kind of history repeating itself, and they might focus on those 80% of explained cases, and in another 75 years we might be in the same place as we are now.
And I'll also add to that question: who would you pick as your new Hynek to head that project?
Oh my goodness! Oh, that's a harder question to answer.
Yeah, I figured.
Yeah, I'm tempering my enthusiasm as we continue to move forward with this ongoing story. Admittedly, I just did a radio interview for local radio here in Albuquerque, New Mexico on Saturday, and we were discussing this very thing, kind of the nature of how this has evolved really since the New York Times article, which I think we'll all agree, and I think your audience would agree, that was the pivotal moment, right? The New York Times article in December 20, everything changed. I've had people visiting here just in the last year. And when I asked them, well, what got you interested? They said, I didn't even give UFOs a second thought until the New York Times article in, December of 2017. But I've been interviewed on Russian TV news as well as other organizations and news outlets regarding what my thoughts are. And this was leading up to the Pentagon report. At that time, as now, I say, I think we need to temper our expectations accordingly. But the one thing that I always like to caution people about is, again, not sounding like a broken record, we have 75 years worth of civilian and military case files within the public domain. I am not holding my breath waiting to see what the government's going to tell us. I'm going to continue doing the research that I've been doing for 32 years because I think it's a pipe dream to think we're going to have disclosure. And by that, I mean with a capital D, as many people, there's many researchers that make a living just lecturing on disclosure and what may or may not happen. Again, it's idle speculation. And really, the best people that know what's going to happen are the people that are on the inside. And obviously, they're not talking.
Yeah. Just FYI to the audience, if you do have a question and we see your super chat, we're just saving it for the end. And we'll save these questions for Mr. Marler at the end of the show. So we're not ignoring it, just FYI. We'll get to it. But I just want to go back to the triangles for a second. Take subsonic out of it.
Sure.
Do we have structured triangle craft? Because when I think of, I mean, you were in one of the 2 seasons of Unidentified, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Correct. Yes.
Season 2. And so I believe in season 1, there was a gentleman by the name of Michael Villa, who was a a Navy crypto something or other, really smart guy, spoke several languages, and he was skylarking in the Gulf of the Gulf of Persia during I believe the first Iraq War, if I'm not mistaken. And at the time, that fleet of ships was the most secure airspace on the planet.
Yeah.
And he's skylarking, and all of a sudden he sees a triangle from the back of the ship hover quietly over to the bow of the boat and then eventually disappear. And then when he runs downstairs to the central command, nobody's talking about it. It's not on radar. It's like he was thinking he was going to go down there and see pure chaos, and nobody picked it up. So, I mean, part of me thinks I come into this with a bias because I've had an experience, but I try my best to not let that bias leak through when we talk about this. But it is difficult for me. But I am curious. But I never put out of the realm of human possibility for humans to figure out some pretty wild stuff. So I mean, have you heard of anything, or any of your sources or people behind the scenes have been talking about, you know, a triangled structured craft that has the ability to look incredibly heavy? So it's either a balloon or it's a craft that has figured out something that doesn't rely on thrust and lift to propel it. Exactly. So, I mean, are there any sort of inklings? I know you don't, it's pure speculation, but I'm curious to know if you have heard of any technology from human hands.
Well, let me first be very clear, because sometimes it get painted with a broad brush. I concede that some of the modern triangles could be military. But that being said, I'm not endorsing, again, the quote unquote TR-3B.
Right.
I think we can delineate that. There's the TR-3B, which is a story unto itself, very specific, originating from one person that was a supposed whistleblower back in the 1990s. He's now deceased. So when you say TR-3B, you're basically saying, I believe and endorse the story that came out of this man's mouth.
Yeah. I don't believe in the TR-3B. Yeah. I don't think it's something that's valid, but I'm curious to know if there's anything that is in that realm that, just forget the name, but just the idea of it, the concept of it.
Well, Luis, let me answer your question this way, because in the course of doing the Unidentified show, I received hundreds of emails and reports worldwide, because it eventually aired all over. I had people from Rome contacting me, Rome, Italy, in Germany. I mean, it was crazy.
It's on a triangle. That's very big.
Exactly. So, but one of the interesting reports that I received was from a United States commercial airline pilot. And he felt compelled to reach out to me. And I have no reason to doubt this man's testimony, but I think it speaks to what you're talking about. And forgive me, I forget the year. I believe it was in the 1990s. He was on a commercial flight across the country, and he was diverted over and near the White Sands missile range here in New Mexico, just south of my location, not too far. And he stated it was around 12:30, if I remember correctly. Very sunny, clear day. And for anybody that's been to New Mexico, White Sands, it's very white. It's the gypsum sand down there, and it's just highly reflective.
Go down there and see it. I've never seen it with my own eyes.
Yeah, if anybody hasn't been there, I highly recommend it. But the point is, as he was flying and diverted over this air corridor, he looked down and imagined this bright white sand. He noticed very close to that, where Holloman Air Force Base is located, he saw a perfect large equilateral triangle sitting on the tarmac. Now, as far as how big, I don't know. I mean, admittedly, you know, he's glancing down from his commercial plane, but I just simply use that as an example to suggest that, look, we know we have the B-2, we know we have the F-117A, and we also know those things are antiquated.
Right.
There has to be the next gen aircraft that we don't know about. And so I think we need to be careful. And I'm a huge fan of UFO history. To use a historical corollary as a cautionary tale in this case, we need to be careful with modern day triangle reports and are automatically ascribing them to extraterrestrial or exotic technology from somewhere else. The reason I say that is going through the files over the course of the last year, and even in my research in the book, over the Antelope Valley area of California, in the early to mid 80s, we were getting UFO reports from people saying they saw a black bat wing shaped object that was flying over the Antelope Valley. As we found out later, it was the B-2 stealth bomber that was doing test flights. We didn't know what the B-2 was at that time. So we need to be somewhat humble in our approach towards these things. But this is why I'm so focused on looking at the history. We know, I think with a fair degree of certainty, I think you would agree as well, what state-of-the-art technology was in 1940, 1950, 1960, admittedly, in comparison to today, where we don't know what state-of-the-art technology, unless we're working on those classified compartmental programs. So when you look back to the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, as this 100+ cases that I've amassed in the last year demonstrates, they're describing triangles with the points, lights at each point, sometimes a red light in the center, moving very slowly just over the treetops, not making a sound. I know some people like to think that we've had this secret technology for decades, but in my opinion, that's a revisionist history bordering on the delusional, because we have no evidence to support that. And so it's the historical cases, looking through the lens of history with what we know now regarding technology then, that I think is the strongest argument for at least some, again, underline that 3 times, some of these triangles being maybe from somewhere else.
And any of these triangle reports, you get the sense when you look at it from below, it's a triangle. But do you ever get a sense for like the full profile? There's been recent reports about pyramid-shaped craft, and that seems even stranger, right? Because that's a obviously under aerodynamic shape. Have you seen any evidence to support that, flying pyramids?
Well, rather, I have found a few pyramidal UFO reports in the historical case files. And as you mentioned in your monologue, I believe, looking at an object from different perspectives will yield a different shape. We have a number of rectangles that have been reported in conjunction with triangles. And in the famous January 5th, 2000 case in Southern Illinois, I investigated, the initial witness said he saw what looked like a house or a boxcar that was floating over some trees. And he saw this bank of windows. Well, later we had reports of triangles being seen. So I'm still, it's 22 years later, I'm still wrestling with, did he truly see a rectangle? Because we did have another subsequent report that came forward saying that they saw a triangular object, very clearly triangle, because they could see it from different perspectives. Or did he just simply see one of the sides of the triangle that had some height to it?
I'm curious, have you ever, I'm sure you've been asked this, but I don't ever remember you answering it. So that's why I'm asking. So forgive me if you've been asked this a billion times, but have you ever had an experience yourself?
I have seen unusual lights in the sky, very high altitude, moving in nonlinear motion, but I always qualify that by saying I'm not saying it's a UFO, as far as it might have a prosaic explanation. For me, this is just me personally, for David Marler to say he saw a UFO, I need to see the rivets on the damn thing. I need to see detail. Lights in the sky generally don't impress me. I mean, just to be honest with you, and even going through the UFO reports again, we have multiple lights in the sky reports. They could be almost anything. I think, we have different degrees, rather you were talking about the different types of UFOs being seen. I also think we have degrees of UFO reporting. Distant lights in the sky don't impress me. Maybe low altitude lights reflecting maybe on the tops of the trees, then you raise the bar of credibility a little bit higher. It's like, okay, that's interesting. It's close enough to where it's reflecting light on the treetops, and you can obviously go back and measure the distance to get an idea how close it was. Then we get into the structured vehicles, whether it's triangles or, cigar-shaped objects, rectangles, what have you. Then you get into a whole other realm. So again, I think there's different shapes, to your point, that you brought up. And there's different degrees as far as maybe interest or credibility regarding some of these reports. So it's a mixed bag, though. I can tell you, I found reports of flying crosses, reports of flying dumbbells, objects that look like an ice cream cone that were sketched and described. Wow. And I will tell you also, varying degrees of artistic merit when it comes to eyewitness sketches. I mean, some of these are so crude, it looks like they drew them with a pencil and with their foot. Whereas other ones were extremely artistic. In fact, I'd love to just publicly display some of the really nice artwork that's contained in some of these files.
Yeah, I'd love to check that out. Rather, do you have a question?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering, what made you focus particularly on the Black Triangle UFOs?
Yeah, excellent question. Back to what I alluded to, the January 5th, 2000 Illinois case. I got involved in 1990, as Luis mentioned in his introduction. And at that time, there were some big topics. Certainly, Bob Lazar was one of those. Gulf Breeze, Florida, the UFO sightings they were having down there. And really, if I was to say the top three, the third one would be the famous Belgian wave of these large triangles that were being reported. And I was coming in 1990. And again, I held that same kind of mindset. It's like lights in the sky, way off in the distance. It's like, that doesn't impress me. The gendarmes that were reporting these triangles, though, were describing them hovering very low over the fields, illuminating the trees, describing structure. And the fact that they had that type of quality reports, so many reports, and then, as you and your audience know, the Belgian military was actually acknowledging the sightings and sharing the radar data that the F-16 obtained on one of the attempted identifications or intercepts. Again, raising that bar of credibility. It's like, okay, you piqued my interest on this. So I read about it, but purely academic. I was new to UFOs. And I think you and your audience know when you first get involved in this, it's just you're drinking water out of a fire hose. It's like, where do I begin?
Yeah.
And, but I was interested in the Belgian wave and I continued to listen to it. And Bob Pratt, who is unfortunately no longer with us, you know, he had done a number of articles on the Belgian wave and he had investigated some other triangles in the past. But so I just kind of put that on back burner and then got involved with MUFON, started doing investigations. And then fast forward to 2000, January 5th, 2000, we had this series of triangular UFO reports over Southern Illinois. And, you know, rather what I was struck with was sitting across the desk in the police departments, talking to the police officers, riding in the squad cars, retracing their steps and hearing the descriptions, seeing their sketches of the object, the lighting characteristics, the flight dynamics. I was immediately having flashbacks to interviews with the gendarmes in Belgium, you know, and that was in roughly 1990. So here we are 10 years later, all the way on the other side of the globe, and they're describing similar things. And so I thought, if there's parallels there, are there other parallels? And I had a very small library at the time, back in the, you know, around 2000. But I started gathering bits of information, trying to see, are there other triangle cases? Slowly but surely, I started building an argument for the historical aspect of these things, which led to my book in 2013. And then most recently, having this huge amount of historical case material that's not available anywhere else dropped in my lap, I wanted to take the course of this last year and go through that new data set. And what I found was the same shape, same flight characteristics, similar lighting characteristics are in these reports. And the thing I like to point out is in 2021, I'm sorry, 2020, when the Unidentified episode aired, I got a lot of reports. People claiming they had a sighting of a triangle like that in 1972, 1971, 1965. Not that I am calling them a liar, but that's interesting. What's really interesting, though, is when we have contemporaneous reports written, signed, dated, and filed from the 1950s and the 1960s. There's no doubt that at least that report was filed at that time. Now, what they saw, what the explanation is, that's up for debate. But when you find historic case files like that have been filed away for decades, and it's mirroring what's being reported today, again, some of these may be military, but you simply cannot ignore 75 years worth of data. And again, it gets back to what we were talking about at the top of the show. It doesn't matter what you believe if the data is arguing against that belief. I mean, we have to concede, we have to yield to the information at hand.
Yeah, have you seen any patterns in the data, like the Belgian wave and such? Do they kind of come in waves, or is it
Well, it's
sustained?
interesting. Yeah, in British Columbia, and pardon me, I'm going to just reflect on my notes right here because, again, I have over 100 cases that I've just recently assembled. We had a series of sightings in Ontario, British Columbia, and I believe it was in 66, if I'm not mistaken. March 25th, 66, the Saanich Inlet, there was multiple sightings of 2 triangular UFOs, not one, but 2, operating in conjunction with each other. And then based on the newspaper accounts, there was additional sightings 6 days later on March 31st, 1966. And then the very next day, April 1st, another series of triangular UFO reports occurred. And these were from different newspapers that were chronicling this. And that's what's interesting is looking at this historical data set, we have government files, we have newspaper accounts, teletypes, handwritten letters, typewritten letters. We have audio testimony. I have audio interviews with witnesses that describe the triangular UFO. One's from Rochester, New York in the 1960s. A young man was working at a golf course and around 12:30 at night described a triangle hovering over the golf course with 3 steady orange amber lights, one at each point. And the object moved slowly, silently over the golf course. And later, another employee at another golf course in Rochester described seeing the same thing. But we not only have the audio recording, which actually that's what this recording is of this Rochester, New York witness. But we have the handwritten testimony from him, and we have a copy of the Rochester Police Department report because he immediately called the police who showed up on the scene. Unfortunately, the UFO had departed and the officer didn't see it, but we also have the police report. So we have a lot of disparate types of information, which when you pull it all together is really interesting.
Did anyone else on that day in that part of New York also file a report?
I think I misspoke. I said Rochester, New York. I think it was Rochester, Minnesota, actually.
Okay.
So I apologize. Again, lots of cases floating around in my gray matter lately. But what's interesting is the very next day, there was a sighting, I believe, in New Hampshire of a triangle. And that's what's interesting. All of the case files here are filed chronologically. So it's very easy to start with 47, work your way through 47, 48, 49. But to your point, Luis, which is interesting, is you not only get these cases put together, but you sometimes see that, well, there was a sighting here in Illinois in May, and the very next day or 2 days later, there was one over in Indiana. And then another day later, there was one over here in Pennsylvania. So it maybe gives you insight into patterns or into areas of activity. But as far as an actual flap, a concentration of UFO sightings in one particular area, the most prominent one, which I've discussed previously, was from 1975, April 3rd to April 9th, 1975, over Lumberton, North Carolina. My personal friend and colleague, Lee Spiegel, in his early UFO career, was actually asked to go down to Lumberton at the behest of Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Hynek called him and said, Lee, we need an investigator. We've got police officers seeing UFOs. And as Lee's told me many, many times, he goes, I was so excited. He goes, I've always wanted to go see a flying saucer. And Hynek quickly corrected him. He goes, no, Lee. He goes, you don't understand. These police officers aren't describing a flying saucer. They're describing a flying triangle. And Lee acknowledges even today, he goes, I was disappointed. It's like, I want to see a flying saucer. I don't want to see a triangle. And he even said that to Hynek, and Hynek said, well, Lee, if you don't want to go, I'll get someone else. He goes, no, you're Dr. Hynek. If you're asking me to go down there, I'll go down there. And long story short, it's one of these rare instances where he went down as an investigator, and literally just the evening before, a number of police officers had sighted this triangular object moving over a field. And he went out on location the very next night with the officers. And they're describing what transpired as far as, well, we saw a light over the trees, and then it slowly started approaching us. And then as it got overhead, we could see it was this triangular object with lights. As they're standing on location, what do they see over the trees? That same light. And what do they see with Lee standing there as an investigator? They see the light approaching, and it reproduced what it did the previous night, to the point where the triangle came directly over a group of squad cars and these police officers and Lee. And when it was overhead, silently overhead, it shot a beam of light, a spotlight down on them.
How did we not get this story out of Lee when he was here? How did we not get? I mean, time flew when Lee was here. It was
absolutely.
He's got a lot of stories.
Back.
If you have him back, you'll have to.
That is wild. I've never heard that story.
Well, what's interesting about this is Lee and I didn't know each other prior to me writing my book. He contacted me, though, after he had read my book, and he goes, I didn't realize until you stated it that was the first concentrated flap or wave of sightings of triangles in a geographic area. I said, yeah. I said, based on the evidence, I can only go based on what I found. There might be other data out there I haven't seen yet. I said, but yes, I said, you had a sustained series of triangular UFO reports by civilians, by police officers in a concentrated area for basically a week. And I said, it was the first concentrated wave of sightings of those things. Certainly later we had the Hudson Valley wave, and we had other sightings as well. We have certainly the Phoenix Lights. People like to throw that into the same category, but he was unaware of that. And subsequent to our conversations and our friendship that's developed over the years, he's actually gotten me in touch with Ron Thompson, who is still alive, still with us. And he was one of the police officers from Lumberton, North Carolina.
Wow. Where are you? Is there any place that you're posting? And this is kind of one of the questions we had from the audience. But is there? Let me see if I can find. It's this one here from Robert George. Please ask David if there's any public way to access his library without invading his privacy. And also, are you posting those audio tapes of those witnesses anywhere?
Yes. Well, I'll answer the last question first. On my website, www.davidmarlerufo.com. I've actually added an audio archives tab because a lot of people knew I was working on this after I obtained these tapes. And so I've done just initial sampling. There's about, I think, a dozen or 14 historic audio recordings ranging back to the 1950s all the way through the 60s. And I did put some of those on there. There we go. Excellent. Yep. And if you go to the SoundCloud link there, you should be able to pull those up. And I haven't checked it in a while. Hopefully it's still there.
Hopefully we'll find out. That's what happens to our Discord link all the time. By the way, Discord link is in the description.
So there we have some interviews.
Okay, cool.
We have some shows. There's one from New Zealand. It's a rare radio show from New Zealand from the 1960s.
Oh my God. How did I miss this on your website?
I initially posted some of the radio shows, historic radio shows, for a very simple reason. They're much better audio quality. Admittedly, when you have someone like a UFO investigator in the 1950s and 60s, they're holding the microphone here, and then they're holding it to the witness, and then they're pulling it back. So the audio quality sometimes varies considerably with those raw audio interviews. But I will say there's some really good information contained in those recordings. And I have to give a shout out, otherwise I'll kick myself later. I'm working with a number of senior UFO researchers and historians, Mr. Barry Greenwood in Massachusetts, Jan Aldridge in Connecticut, and someone I want to give a special shout out to is Mr. Rod Dyke in Seattle, Washington. Rod's had purchased all of these historic reel-to-reel recordings from Richard Hall when he was getting ready to pass away, who was really the last head of NICAP, one of the last bastions of the original NICAP organization. And Rod had been sitting on these for quite a while, hoping to get them digitized, and really for about, I guess, 20, 30 years, we're talking. And so Rod had seen that the CUFOS and NICAP case files had been shipped here. And he said, Dave, he goes, I've had these audio recordings for a long time. They need to go with the original case files. So after decades of separation, thanks to Rod's generosity, he donated all these historic audio recordings, which we've now not only digitized.
God bless you, Rob, wherever you are.
Special shout out to Rod Dyke for that. But we now have the original reel-to-reels in with the actual case files. And I'm actually slotted to, he found 2 more boxes, which in the next week or two, hopefully I'll be receiving. And I'll be continuing to do the digitization work. Back to the question, though, Luis, as far as the case files, Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldridge were here in September for 2 weeks. They were live-in researchers, and they're scanning and have been scanning over the course of a few years when the files resided in Chicago. All of these case files, when they were here in September for 2 weeks, they scanned 30,000 pages, which is just a little drop in the bucket. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of case files here. The goal is, and I just had a call with Mark Rodiger with Ufos this weekend. The goal is to set up a server or a website where we're going to have all of this material available to the worldwide community. We're not charging for it. We're not making money out of this, quite the contrary. But we want to, because my attitude has always been this, whether it's the files we're talking about here or UFO data in general, the data, the information belongs to everyone. And the more brains, the more eyes we have on this data, someone may come in that's looked at these files that have been looked at for decades with a completely different perspective that might yield new insights into the phenomenon. And so we need to make this readily available to the worldwide community of scientists, lay people, to start looking at the data, but not only the documents, but the audio recordings as well, because there's really good data that's contained therein. But in the short term, what we're trying to do is gradually get that out there. But I appreciate the question that was offered. I do make my research center here open to the general public by appointment. If anybody is ever coming through Albuquerque or New Mexico and they would love to visit, as I mentioned, I've had a number of researchers, one from New York State that came out here. He wanted to see Roswell and do some UFO site tour. And he goes, while I'm there, I've got to see your library. I've heard about it. So he spent some time going through the files. I've even had retired Air Force officers come and look at these files. There was a retired lieutenant colonel who brought himself and his friend, who was a retired colonel in the Air Force, who was in charge of advanced weapons development for the Air Force. They heard me on a local radio show here where we had call in, and they called in and they said, we'd love to see some of the Blue Book material, the Hynek material. So I was graced by having a retired lieutenant colonel and colonel from the Air Force here, and we were sitting talking UFOs. And let me just bring this back to the discussion about the Pentagon and all this information coming out. Despite the fact that we're still clinging to table scraps, right? Table crumbs. We've had the videos, but we have no official documentation regarding the videos yet. Despite it's been since 2017, we don't have any official analysis that's been provided on the part of the government. It's raised the bar of credibility, though, with regard to the subject. And there are people now wanting to talk about the subject coming into this field simply because that skepticism, the ridicule has now eroded. And I mention that because having done many radio shows over the years, I've never had a retired lieutenant colonel or colonel from the Air Force want to come to my home and sit down and talk UFOs. So the climate is changing, I'm happy to say.
Well, no, I think we also recognize that as well. Just with the creation of the SCU, the Galileo project. We just spoke with someone yesterday about a data gathering algorithm AI sort of project where we gather all of the data points, put them into a big computer file, and then we'll be able to pull them up at our fingertips and be able to find patterns. And all of these scientists and people that are devoting their time that we've always wanted to devote their time to. These are the people we've always been screaming for. They're here now.
We're finally here.
Yeah, they're here, and they're like, okay, we got it. And my only fear is that parts of this community don't get so rabid and impatient with the process of science. Like this is going to take them a long time to gather enough data points and do the proper research and write the proper papers before I think it gets to that next level. But I also think part of this is, and I'm curious to think what you think about this, because I mean, we did a big event, 2 big events where we solicited our government, because I feel as taxpayers, we have a right to get some of this information, especially the information that you're talking about, the stuff that's not classified anymore.
Right.
The jets that aren't classified, the radar systems that aren't classified, the places of the parts of the world where we weren't supposed to be.
Right.
It's okay. We all now know that we were there. It's fine. Like, we should be able to look at the Air Force, particularly the Air Force files and Navy files of all of these UFO reports. What's the big deal?
I could not agree with you more, Luis. I'm all about national security. I understand it has its place. We wouldn't be here right now if it wasn't for national security interests. So right. I don't want to infringe into that area, but I completely agree with you. Cases from the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even the 80s, depending on the nature of what it is, that much of that information should be made available to the general public. And whether it's UFOs or anything else, and I was discussing this on the local radio show, we always walk that tight wire between transparency of government as a democracy, to your point, Luis, but also understanding, the importance of national security. But I completely agree that given this new open climate, there should be a lot more historical data that, to your point, does not jeopardize national security, does not divulge any secrets of any kind, that we should be able to see. And the other thing, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because I wanted to bring this up. Digitizing these files and the audio recordings is just step one. Step two is, once it's digitized, not only will it be accessible and being able to be utilized by a much larger group, but exactly to what you touched on. Once it's digital, we can integrate that into a database and let AI take a look at it. So that is the ultimate end goal. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I hope that's where this conversation is eventually going to go to. I just hope that the community has the patience. But rather, did you have a question?
Well, yeah. When you were visited by those military officials, did you get a sense that they were seeking information, or that they maybe had more information than you had? And along these same lines, Aaron Desario had a great question saying, what does Mr. Marler think of all the ex-CIA directors and DNI coming forward saying that there are things out there that we don't understand?
Yeah. With regard to Aaron's question, it's a great question. I think it's interesting, and just rather to your question, they were both retired, so I do want to emphasize that they weren't active duty. So, but I think what I'm about to say ties to Aaron's question as well as yours. Once you're retired, you certainly feel much more freedom to express yourself and to talk about things, as long as, again, you're not divulging state secrets.
Must be nice.
But I think the ex-CIA directors and the DNI coming forward with some very telling statements, it tells me that A, they knew about the subject, which is no surprise, I think, to any of us. But B, they probably had this desire to want to talk about it for many, many years. But like these Air Force retired officers that came to my home, they just didn't feel like the atmosphere was right to have that conversation. And, and I say that because I can tell you, when I first got involved in this in the 90s, talking about UFOs was one thing, but I would go to parties or gatherings and I would have people sidle up to me and say, so I heard you're interested in UFOs. They're almost nervous. They don't want anybody to overhear. And once I say, well, yeah, I'm investigating the subject, I don't know what to make of it. And that's where I'm still at. I'm not quite sure what to make of it all. But I said, yeah, I investigate, credible reports. And then they unload, right? And you've probably been there yourself. Well, I've never told anybody this, but in 1991, and it's like they have to feel like the atmosphere is conducive to having that conversation, without fear of ridicule.
Right.
And I think, and I'm just using that example on a personal level, but I think that's where we are as a society now. As a society, people in general are opening up, like ex-CIA directors, DNI. And I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there that, well, it's a false flag operation. None of this is true, and it's all a hidden agenda. I simply, I'm not into conspiracy theories in general. I don't go down the conspiracy rabbit holes. I think you mentioned, Luis, in the introduction. I just don't see why they would do that. Why would they let the genie out of the bottle, which is the way I like to put it. It's kind of like once you created the atomic bomb and the plans were out there, the genie's out of the bottle. You can't put it back. You're in a new era.
Right.
And acknowledging the UFO UAP subject, we can't go back to December 1969, where the Air Force said it doesn't exist, it doesn't pose a threat to national security, and it doesn't demonstrate any scientific principles beyond our understanding. that day is gone. That's in the history books. File that away. You can't go back to pre-New York Times article, December 2017. We're moving forward. There's no going back at this point, other than the importance of going back and looking at these historical case files.
Well, going back to what you said about being at a party and having somebody kind of unload their, especially if they feel this setting is right. All right, can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Are you a married man?
I am. I have a great wife.
How does she? Okay, so how does your partner deal with this? How does she feel about it? Does she go anytime we're at a Christmas party or a gathering and somebody yells, "Hey, David, here you're into UFOs"? To her, the eyes roll into the back of her head. She goes,
No.
"All right, here we go."
No,
or is she like, "Oh yeah, David's got something to tell you."
Oh yeah. No, she's very supportive. That's almost an understatement. It's funny you asked that, Luis. No one's ever asked me that, so I really appreciate it.
I love asking all my guests that question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. No, I've been a confirmed bachelor for most of my life. It wasn't until I was 50 years old that I got married not too long ago. And one of the reasons
you had a good run, my son.
I sowed my oats. I did all that fun stuff when I partied. I was in the 80s. It's like,
I can just see you with a sniffer of like a fine whiskey and a cigarette. Like, what's his name on Mad Men? That silver-haired fox. I can't remember his name. And just being just being a madman. But absolutely. I love it. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go on.
No. But the point is, I got involved in 1990. I was still relatively young. And so, as I like to say, I was married to UFOs before I was married to anybody else. And I had seen over the years, to be completely honest with you, individuals, whether it was men or women, that were interested in the UFO subjects, but their partners or their spouses were not. And no lie, some of those marriages didn't last.
Yeah.
And I always go back, and I love the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But one of the reasons I like it is because I've dealt with witnesses who had a sighting, but their spouse didn't. And I would talk to the spouse as much as the witness, and they're trying to wrap their minds understand, like, why is he so fascinated? I don't get it.
Right.
And it is very experiential, a UFO sighting, especially a close encounter UFO sighting. If you didn't share the experience, you can sympathize, but you can't empathize.
Right.
And I've seen that bring an end to some marriages over the years. And I've seen people, whether men or women, interested in UFOs and their spouse wasn't, where it became so consuming that their spouse finally said, "You know what? I'm done." And so I realized very quickly, I need to be extremely judicious if I'm going to settle down with a woman and get married, because I don't want to go down that road. And I waited until I was 50 years old. And, and you can't make this stuff up, to use the old phrase. In my previous job, I was down in Roswell on business. And one of my customers down there mentioned something about the fact, it's just like, "So you're not dating anybody?" I said, "No." I said, I've been traveling a lot and it's hard to maintain a relationship." And
as he takes a drag from his cigarette.
Yeah. And she's like, she was like, "I've got this friend, and her friend used to live in Roswell. Not when I met her, but she used to live in Roswell," which is an interesting little connection.
I can see alarm bells already still going off in your head when you heard that.
So, the problem was this, though. My wife, she was so accustomed to kind of the pop culture aspects of, gray aliens and alien t-shirts. She really hadn't talked to anybody that really seriously looked at the UFO subject. So the running joke that we still reminisce about is, before our first date, I didn't know anything about her other than a picture and her name that her friend described. But she went online and cyber-stalked me and pulled up all my lecture videos. And so she already had a good idea.
Before your first date.
Before my first date. So,
oh, man. Okay.
She said she was doing research.
She David Marlered you.
I still tell her, you were cyber-stalking me. You can call it research. You were cyber-stalking. But long story short, she obviously knew, based on my lectures, and she had found some excerpts of my book, that I do treat it very seriously. And in fact, when we do talk at family functions, I always tell her, I'm not going to bring up the UFO subject. I I understand UFOs is my interest. I understand it's not everyone's interest.
Right.
But I will tell you, when I go to these family functions, I don't bring it up, but my in-laws will bring it up.
Yeah.
They'll come over and say, so, what's the latest in the UFO world? Or have you done any productions lately? And I always say after we leave and we're driving home, it's like, just for the record, I didn't bring it up. They did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
it's a fun place that's getting to now.
Yeah. But sure. I have a wonderful wife, wonderful relationship. She's helped me with my research. She's attended many conferences with me. And, it was, I wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for her, because she's so supportive, and just want to give her a shout out. But, and my daughters, I have 2 stepdaughters, and they're 11 and 13, and they're now interested in the subject. And they've even told their teachers, my dad investigates UFOs. And they're like, well, we'll have to have him come to the school and give a lecture.
Wow. Okay. Cause see, this is where I am, and I'm not a father yet, but this is kind of where I am. I'm not 100% sure about what I'm talking about. And it's partly because of children. Like, I've got a niece and a nephew, and I don't want to start filling their heads with information that is unverifiable and in some ways unscientific, but their uncle's into it. And he really loves talking about it, but they don't understand the nuances of belief systems and this and that. Exactly. So how do you responsibly talk to kids, your stepdaughters, about this without, or do you have that fear that you might be pumping in information that could set them off on a path that, in some cases, like you said, with some marriages and some belief systems, could be destructive to your personal life? So how do you do that? I'm just curious as a dad.
Yeah, no, I've done a lot of school lectures over the years, especially when I was with Illinois MUFON. And the way I frame it is I try to obviously touch on those cases, Luis, to your point, that are well documented, military cases, Project Blue Book cases, where, look, it's not just somebody saying this. Air Force investigators went out, investigated, they talked to the witness, like the Lonnie Zamora case, right, from Socorro, New Mexico, for example. I think it's all in how, and not just UFOs, but anything you could say this about, it's how you frame the discussion. I preface by saying that I'm going to tell you about some experiences that people claim that they had. I can't prove it any more than I can disprove it. And I think it's just framing it that way. What I always try to do, depending on the age of the kids, though, if it's elementary or like junior high, I always try to steer it back to the point where, we try to take a scientific approach to this. If you're interested in UFOs, study your science, study your physics, make sure that you study hard now if you really want to investigate UFOs. So I always try to gear it to where I'm trying to tell them, you need to continue to do your homework and listen to the teachers and learn, because it's only through the lens of science that we're going to understand a lot of this.
How would you, if say I could make you principal of a school, where would you put this topic? Okay, yeah, please.
Absolutely. Well, and if I may, I had the pleasure of giving a UFO lecture at the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque, which is a rare honor to be able to give a university level lecture on the subject. And it was based on the fact that I have an agreement signed with the University of New Mexico that when I die, hopefully no time soon, that this entire UFO archive will be gathered together at UNM and will be a continual repository of historical UFO information. And when they asked, would I be a featured speaker at their annual lecture series, I said, yes, I'd love to do that. But I decided to approach the lecture, and I'm answering your question in a roundabout way. I approached it in the way that I approached them about the collection that I had. I said, whether you relegate UFOs to fact, fiction, or folklore, everyone in this room can agree it's part of our culture, it's part of our history. So we start with a foundation where we're all in agreement. Nobody can deny that UFOs isn't part of our culture, isn't part of our history.
Right.
Now,
look at this movie theater every summer.
Well, exactly. But so you start with a foundation where we can all agree. Now, we can all go off on different tangents after that. Well, yes, it's part of history, but I believe it's factual and it's extraterrestrials visiting us. I believe it's real, but it's a cultural mythology that built out of the space age. you can go into different angles, different thoughts on that. But it was selling UNM on the idea of UFOs as history and culture that they were interested in the collection. And so I decided to use that as a springboard for my lecture with the audience, because I had academics in that audience. I had general public. I had administrators from the university there. The Dean of Library Sciences and the Southwest Special Collection Group actually introduced me. And not only did we do a lecture, they had representatives from the university come and cherry pick items from my collection. And we had a huge gallery display in the adjoining room of sketches, UFO reports, government documents, photographs.
Were you pinching yourself during this? Were you like, how did we get here?
It was a huge honor. And we just had a changing of the guard at the University of New Mexico. Dean Leo Lowe has taken over as the Dean of Library Science. I met with him about 4 or 5 weeks ago now and wanted to introduce myself. He actually reached out to me because he had heard about my lecture there and my collection that will eventually go there. Had a wonderful 1.5 hour long conversation with the dean in his office. And one of the other administrators were there who knew of my work. And during the course of conversation, the administrator looked at the dean and said, I think we need to have Dave back to do a second lecture on UFOs.
How cool.
And I was watching his body language. He didn't flinch an inch. He said, yeah, I think we should probably try to get that lined up maybe in 2021, 2022. And so
let us know, because I might want to take a little. I'm in Los Angeles. It wouldn't be that much of a drive to get out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to see a lecture, because I'm thinking I could totally see you on a TED Talk. You haven't done a TED Talk yet, right?
No, don't think so.
You need a TED Talk. You'd be great TED Talk.
So I may incorporate some of this new material that I've uncovered and maybe educate them on some additional history of the subject. But and I will say that UNM's been great as a research resource as well. When Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldridge were here, I brought them to the university because they were just amazed that a university was taking the subject seriously. And so we had a wonderful discussion with Tomas, the director of the Southwest Special Collections Group, and had a little tour of the library, went down in the archives. And I showed Barry and Jan when they were there, an area that I often would frequent prior to COVID. It's their microfilm library. Extensive historical newspapers from North America, Latin America, and other countries going back to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And I'm sure there's a lot of historical UFO accounts that haven't even been discovered yet that are lurking in those microfilms.
Yeah. Rather, did you have a question? I didn't want to cut you off. I know I've just been asking questions here.
Yeah, I do have a question about your prior history. I read on your website that you've been a polysomatic technician. I might not be saying that right, but studying sleep disorders. And I'm curious if that gave you any insight into the abduction phenomenon. If you think that maybe there's theories that it might be related to sleep paralysis and stuff like that. And just kind of what your stance is on those more kind of woo aspects of this phenomenon.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate the question, rather. Again, no one's ever really touched on that. So I really appreciate going down this
I had sleep apnea questions for him before the show started.
I will tell you that I've adjusted my bio because I decided not to renew my credentialing for this calendar year. Every 5 years, you're due for renewal. I'm now more in a hospital administration role, so I'm not in the clinical realm. So I decided to let my certification lapse. So in the interest of full disclosure, I'm no longer a registered polysomnographic technician as of January 1st. But yes, you're absolutely right. I started in sleep medicine in 1998. So I was already 8 years into the UFO research at that point. And to your point, yes, I think there's some correlations between sleep disorders and related symptoms and the abduction phenomenon. Now, please, before people start putting negative things in the chat, I'm not explaining away the alien abduction phenomenon. All I'm simply saying is I think we should always have a pragmatic approach towards abduction research, just like we do UFO sightings, as I alluded to earlier. If we get a report, say today, that someone saw a UFO, I'm not going to leap to the extraterrestrial conclusion. I might check with the FAA. I'll check with Kirtland Air Force Base to see if they had any military operations at the time. Were there any Elon Musk satellites that were deployed that someone was seeing? Within the last year, I had someone see the Starlink satellites, and they filmed it and they thought it was a UFO. I'm saying, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. It's actually satellites. But just like with UFO sightings, we eliminate the knowns before we start saying this might be unknown. The same holds true for abduction research. I'm also certified in hypnotherapy, and I'd done some regressive hypnosis back in the early 90s with people that had claimed to have abduction experiences. Again, I'm not saying they didn't. But in my opinion, if you're going to do abduction research, and I know this requires resources that many researchers don't have, if you have someone that thinks they've been abducted, regressive hypnosis can be used. It's a tool, but it's not a guarantee that something really happened. There's a reason we don't use hypnotic testimony in a court of law. But in addition to hypnosis, I think there should also be blood work done. Were there any outside chemical agents that this person had in their system that might have led them to hallucinate to believe this? And to your point, rather, did they ever have a sleep study to see if they've had any type of sleep disorder? Because I am here to tell you, in a clinical environment at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, where that's where I was trained and where I did the sleep studies, I was in a controlled lab with other lab technicians. I have a sleep patient in the room. They're being videotaped. They're hooked up to our PSG system, polysomnographic system. I'm monitoring everything from brain waves to eye movements to muscle tone to heart rate. They weren't abducted. There wasn't missing time because my needles on my old paper records at that time would have gone crazy. But I would go in after their period of study was over, and they would say, "Wow, that was really weird." What? Well, I saw a figure at the foot of my bed, and I saw these like balls of light flying around the room. I was watching the room. It was all videotaped. Physiological parameters were being monitored. There was no paranormal activity. It was generated from the mind. Now, if you take someone like that has sleep paralysis, that has hypnagogic hallucinations, who doesn't know it's associated with sleep disorders, and who watches the History Channel and watches these documentaries and has a fantasy-prone personality, it's very likely they might legitimately and honestly believe they were abducted by aliens. Doesn't mean it's so. And so again, let me qualify. I'm not discounting alien abduction altogether. But what I'm saying is, just like with UFO sightings, I think a large percentage could be explained away in conventional terms.
Do you think, what about the small percentage of that? Do you think that there is something tangible there when it comes to the reporting of these entities? I mean, we got as far as a Harvard professor to say he believes that these experiences are being had. Yeah. So I'm curious to know, I mean, how far do you go on that? Because that's something that on this show we every day are trying to push ourselves to understand more. But like, just going back to what you said earlier, the only thing that's really gonna make you understand is experiencing it firsthand. Yeah,
I'm a historian and researcher, but nothing beats actually having the experience, and in fact, witnesses I've talked to, I said, I'm envious. I said, I pour over these reports and these news accounts going back decades, but you apparently actually had your own sighting of one of these things. Nothing beats actual experience. Right.
But do you think there's anything to that? What do you think? I'm just curious. I know it's speculation. I'm kind of painting you in a corner.
Sure. No. But it's a fair question, Luis. Yeah. I think if you concede that some UFOs are maybe someone else's technology from God knows where, and you look at the decades worth of reports of entities, humanoids that have been seen near some of these objects, it's just the next step to believe, well, if there's objects and there's occupants, could there be the possibility of interaction? And there are some cases that I think really stand out. The Betty Barney Hill case, I still am very impressed with that. Not because of what they said, but because of some of the outside validation, the star map being one. I think that's very interesting.
Well, for me, it's just the historical time. Like being an interracial couple in the late to mid 60s was not a popular thing, yeah, so for you to come out and
in New Hampshire
to bring more attention to that, it makes absolutely no sense to me that
Right,
they would
right.
just make that up.
Yeah, and certainly I've met Kathleen Martin on a number of occasions, and I know and respect Kathleen, and her recollections of her Aunt Betty and Uncle Barney. I mean, I think that they were decent stand-up people. Admittedly, I think Betty started seeing UFOs everywhere later in life. If you talk to people that knew her or met her, she claimed to have had a lot of other sightings. I mean, and a lot of other sightings. Unfortunately, Barney passed away, at a fairly early age due to a stroke. So unfortunately, we it'd be interesting to see if he had claimed to have had subsequent experiences after that. But there's that. And then some of the people that I've talked to that have connections within the DoD, apparently, again, if you can believe the stories, but they do come from what I would consider credible sources. Some, fairly high level people within military and intelligence circles have actually had abduction experiences. So this isn't Billy Bob on a tractor, like, the skeptics like to throw out, the uneducated, toothless farmer from, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And so, as I always like to say with UFOs, it's not that I believe people saw UFOs. I can't summarily discount all of the testimony. It's a lot of testimony. To say, I don't believe anybody ever saw a genuine UFO, that's a big statement. I mean, we have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of cases on file now. And so I think it's arrogant to just summarily discount the possibility of alien abduction. I don't think we can rule anything out, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and I think you just answered one of our...
But entertaining ideas and believing ideas are two different things.
Right. Yeah, and I think that kind of answers John Music's question here. Millions per year say they've had non-human encounters / abductions. Do you believe at least some of them for sure? They can't all be lying, hallucination, misidentifying. Which I
agree with you. I can't discount all that testimony. And I always use the old phrase, where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a hell of a lot of smoke with this UFO subject.
Indeed. Rather, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. Very, very interesting.
And great question, by the way.
Yeah, no problem. Wow, we're really coming up with a good one today. So I do have I'm curious, have you ever reached out to Ted Rowe at the National Aviation Reporting Center on anomalous phenomena and his NARCAP, his just archive of pilots?
No, it's funny you bring him up, because we've never crossed paths with conferences, lectures, and mutual friends. Ted and I have just never connected, which is
interesting.
Kind of funny.
We should hook you guys up. That would be interesting, because I'm curious to know if there's any way you guys could help each other, especially just from the aviation standpoint. I'm sure there's, or worst case scenario, have a really interesting discussion, because he's fun to talk to, and he's also someone who's had. I love Ted because he's not afraid to tell you his stories, and some of them borderline on just like, wow, okay.
Right.
Wow. And then you look at his work and you look who he's working for. And then you see that the FAA is now bringing his work into the fold to help explain what pilots could be seeing and where to report it and how to do it. And I thank God every day for Alex Dietrich and David Fravor and Ryan Graves, because every time, and this is why I encourage them to talk about it as much as they can, because every time they do, it kills the stigma. It helps more pilots and more veterans come out of the woodwork and tell their stories, because now they know there's no punishment for it anymore.
I agree.
And if they see their fellow service member talking about it, well, maybe I should too.
Well, and quite often you hear this term thrown around, but I do mean it sincerely. It took courage for them to come forward with their reputations and with their background. And I don't think we'd be here if it wasn't for that testimony, to be quite honest. I mean, we still have these mysterious DOD videos, which are still being argued.
If it was just videos, I don't think it would have been a big a deal as people are making it today.
Absolutely.
It's the testimony that accompanies those videos that makes it compelling.
It provides context, Luis, because as I mentioned earlier, even though we have those videos, we still have yet to get one page of official documentation or analysis from the government regarding any of them. So all we have are these videos, and it's pretty much, subjective as far as what you think. I think some of the prosaic explanations are just ridiculous in the extreme. And I think it's an insult to these pilots because, again, if it was just videos without that context, as you mentioned, Luis, if you discount the videos, you're almost discounting the credibility and the training of these pilots. It's not just that we have a video. We have a pilot that said he saw the video, saw the object that it performed.
Yeah, I'll push back on that a little bit because it's really only the Nimitz video that we actually know about the pilot, right? Isn't it the gimbal and the go fast? We have the audio recordings, but we don't actually.
Exactly. Rather, no. Thank you for clarifying. But the Nimitz is the one I was thinking of. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, some of the other ones that are coming out, and I'll be honest with you, I'm really going to probably incur the wrath of some people on this one. I am not
trust me, David Marler. I'm pretty sure we've almost gotten rid of every single person that this wrath would come from out of our chat and out of our show. There's a few stragglers still hanging on, but I think for the most part that extreme part of the community doesn't watch this show.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, as some people call me the triangle guy. I'm just a guy that's putting together information, but as someone, let me phrase it this way, as someone who would probably more than anyone love to see a valid video with an established provenance of a triangle, I'm not impressed with Jeremy Corbell's triangle video.
Yeah, I'm not either. I love Jeremy Corbell. Nothing personal.
I love those real green
honestly, when we showed those videos on this channel, first words out of my mouth were Mick West is going to have a field day.
Well, and I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I haven't ever talked to Mick West, nor have I talked to Jeremy Corbell in person. But I'm not a video expert, as I always tell people, and they send me photos and videos. But I have talked to a few people, and just based on my own observation, the very first time I looked at that, the one thing I noticed was, okay, that isn't just a triangle. All the other points of light in that video are a triangle. And when you have that, you have to ask yourself, what's the common denominator? And the common denominator is the aperture of the camera.
Right.
And you take any out of focus image, and this was prevalent in the 1980s and 90s with VHS camcorders. We used to get these ubiquitous images of what looked like a donut with little notches taken out. And what it was the aperture of the camera, mechanism of the camera lens. When you took any light and made it out of focus, it generated this image. Right. And so I was kind of taken aback by that. And then I was also surprised to see strobing lights that seemed to be strobing at intervals indicative of any ordinary aircraft. And so I was very unimpressed with that one. I have to tell you.
Yeah, that's pretty much what Mick West did. He took a camera, he put tape over it to replicate an aperture issue, and that's exactly what came out with. It was a bunch of every point of light looked like exactly like what we saw in that video. Well, and look, that's not to say that we're not wrong on this. Like, maybe I am wrong on this. Maybe these things were flashing like that. Maybe they were pyramids, and if they turn out to be awesome, we have something to talk about for years, so
absolutely. And Luis, you bring up a good point. A lot of UFO researchers, quite often they pontificate and they're dead certain on what they're saying. I am human. I can make an error, and I do make errors all the time. Ask my wife. If I ever make a wrong judgment, if I call a UFO and it turns out to be an IFO, I'll be the first to tell you.
Okay, January 5th, 2000. Let me ask you this, because this question was considered a very rude question a few days ago. So I'm just going to ask it to you, and let's see what you respond with it. Have you ever in your, I guess now would it be safe to say about 2 decades you've been looking at this?
3 decades, right?
3 decades. Okay. So 30 years.
2000. Yeah. Wow.
I'm like 5.
Don't worry about it. We're all there. Have you, in this 30-year time frame, have you ever made a mistake, something that you've had to retract or correct? If so, what was it? By the way, I'm a big fan of yours.
No, I can't think of any. Well, the one is actually I left it kind of open-ended in my book, but the one that I told you about that I later found was a balloon. I said, could it be a UFO? Maybe, but maybe not. Because even in the newspaper article, it alluded, well, maybe it could have been a balloon. but I'm sure I've made mistakes over the years. I mean, we're all capable. I can't think of like one in particular, but I've certainly like misquoted or said the wrong date on a case, or, my assessment may have been wrong initially. I mean, but like the January 5th, 2000 case, a lot of people think, well, that was sighted near Scott Air Force Base, therefore it must have been military. Until evidence comes forward that supports that, it's still a UFO. I'm not saying it's extraterrestrial. It's still unidentified. If they roll it out in another decade and say, hey, this is the thing that all those people saw back in 2000, great, let's take it off the list. But you take that one off the list, I still have 102 I just uncovered from the historical files I got to go through. And that's the thing. Some people fixate in this field, researchers and UFO enthusiasts alike, or UAP enthusiasts alike, and they'll focus on one case or one bit of testimony. I'm interested in the big picture. I'm interested in patterns in the data. Because even in patterns in the data, if you say, okay, Marler identified these 20 cases, I'll give you the 19, but that one, you need to throw that out. Okay, we still have 19 cases that are still suggestive of something.
Yeah.
So,
but even if you flip the numbers on that,
sure, one.
Even if 19 of them are explainable, and you got one that is completely batshit crazy, that's a lot.
And
That's a lot.
And here's 102 cases that I've just compiled just in the last year, in addition to the 100+ cases I documented in my book. Right. So again, it's like, you can sit there and make these little arguments, or you can attack one individual, but to attack some of these cases that I might add involve radar. It's not just eyewitness testimony. There's radar confirmation. Again, if you can prove me wrong, please do. There's two things that I ask, though, with regard to disagreement in the UFO field. And unfortunately, we don't see much of this. Let's avoid the vitriol. Let's not make it personal. And if you're going to argue from a skeptical perspective on a case or the subject in general, do it from a point of being educated about the subject. People that just arbitrarily throw explanations out there without any supportive evidence. I've had some people tell me, I think these triangles are all holograms. Okay. Generated by whom, for what purpose, and how did they do that over the decades worldwide?
But also, can you point me to any tech that may be able to remotely replicate something like that?
Well, and I've also, in those cases, because I've had a number of people bring that up. And again, hey, maybe it's an explanation for some of these reports. I'm not saying it isn't. It would be the more modern ones, certainly not the ones from the 40s or 50s or 60s. But even if that were true, how do you get a hologram to be opaque to the point where the witness says, as it was flying overhead, I could see it blotting out the stars?
Yeah. But also, how do you get a hologram to show up on radar?
Yeah.
Well, exactly. How do you have a hologram? What I find is the arguments fit some of the details, but not all of the details.
Right.
Many people have said these things are just stealth blimps, which was an object that purportedly existed in the 1990s. It was in Popular Mechanics, Popular Science magazine. Again, we have no verifiable evidence to support that there's a lot of purported aircraft that have been published in Popular Science, Popular Mechanics over the years. It doesn't mean it exists. And it's much harder, obviously. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we're trying to prove these are extraterrestrial. That's a hard pill to swallow. Right. But if you're saying it's man-made, I would certainly think it's easier for you to find documents or engineers willing to testify before Congress to say, yes, this exists. But again, I don't think any one explanation accounts for all of these triangles. Are some misidentifications? Probably. Are some military aircraft in more the modern era, possibly, but are some highly anomalous that yet defy explanation? Absolutely.
Well, speaking of technology, I'm sorry, Rather, did I cut you off? Did you have a question?
No, go for it.
Okay, so this question came from Grant Levac, and we're going to start getting your questions now, guys. So if you have a question for David Marler, let's get it in there. Could Salvatore Pais's patents for triangle craft have already been exploited / developed? And by the way, Salvatore Pais is going to be on Kurt's channel, Kurt Jaimungal, The Theories of Everything. So that's going to be a must-watch segment. So, but I'm curious to know what you think of that.
Yeah, it's a great question, Grant. And yes, it's quite possible by now it has been exploited. But if I'm not mistaken, I don't think that patent was filed until the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. And Luis, you might be able
right
to
about that.
Yeah. So I think he built the patent based on the UFO reports that existed. It's, the question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? But to Grant's question, and that's a really good point he brings up, and I've had this thrown at me, and I agree. Could we have encountered triangular UFOs in the early modern era, and we wanted to figure out how to engineer? And I'm not saying back engineer. I'm not evoking stories of crashed UFOs, and I get so tired of those stories because, again, there's little evidence to support it. It's a great story, but it's just, I'm very skeptical of the back engineering extraterrestrial vehicles.
Thank you for saying that.
But could genuine triangular UFO sightings in the 40s, 50s, and 60s been the impetus for us to start developing triangles of our own? And to Grant's question, using Salvatore Pais's patent, could they have used that as a template to then develop it? And again, I don't know what state-of-the-art technology is, and I doubt any of your audience members do, unless we're working at Area 51 or other classified, Department of Defense contracting agencies.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Well, like in the 50s, there's a preliminary report on ball lightning, and they were talking about looking at that and trying to theorize if there's sustained fusion reactions in there. And if so, how could we replicate it without actually having that technology to study it, just seeing what it does?
Absolutely. So again, I don't think the triangles have any one explanation depending on what data that you're looking at.
Well, I would love to take the information that Salvatore Pais looked at to come up with his patent and give that to all the scientific community and say, let's see what you guys come up with. Let's see what this, because I think you're right. I think it's, you get this wave in the 70s and they're like, oh, there's something out there that moves silently, is invisible to radar, can turn on the drop of a dime, and it looks like doesn't need any sort of propulsion, lift, and thrust. Great. Awesome. How do we make that?
Exactly. And before I forget, I wanted to mention that I just finally finished going through all of these case files. In 2022, my dear friend and colleague, Philip Mantle in the UK, is going to be shipping his entire extensive UFO file collection here as well. So there will be yet another more UK European based set of UFO case files that I'll be able to go through, and that should be interesting to see what that data yields. And so there's a lot.
Please tell him to not use FedEx.
Oh no.
They have not been very good lately.
No. He just informed me. I said, "Well, how much are we talking here, Phil?" Because I feel it'll be a good pallet. So a pallet of UFO information. So, but I bring that up because a lot of people think, even though we don't have a lot of definitive answers, that doesn't mean we don't have data. We're a data-rich field as far as research, but I don't think a lot of people have taken the time to look at the data. And again, hopefully our digitization will help.
Would you agree? It's just not sexy. Looking at data is not sexy. It's not, and it's certainly not as easy as, oh, look at this video. Look at this video here. Like it's tough because that's sort of from the experiencer standpoint. And look, in my opinion, I think the experiencers are going to have their day in the sun. Mm-hmm. They are going to eventually have their say when this is all said and done, the dust is settled. But this idea that, I forgot my thought talking about experiencers. I'm sorry. I totally had a brain fart there. But
don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, I'm sorry. Rather, you were saying something.
It sounds like a humongous task, digitizing and transcribing all these records. Do you need any help on this? Tony AM is offering his help to volunteer any post-production engineering to clean those recordings. Thanks for that $10 donation, Toby.
Well, actually, that would be wonderful. I went through and I digitized and digitally remastered the 221, I think, that I had done. But with the new set that I have and with the existing research I'm doing, if I could get them digitized, I could certainly get them to someone like Toby. And if he could digitally enhance or remaster those, that would be wonderful.
That would be killer.
What's the best way for Toby to reach you to offer help?
Yeah, my website would be perfect. www.davidmarlerufo.com. And Toby, I'd be happy to send you some additional recordings, but please check out the ones on my website if you haven't already, to listen to those.
Are those downloadable to a file that maybe he can take?
I don't think they're downloadable, but
refinish for you and say, hey, look, what do you think of this? If this is something you're interested in,
Sure. No, I don't think they're downloadable off SoundCloud. I could be wrong, but I can easily get the files to Toby, so that wouldn't be a problem.
Awesome.
But I will add that in the process of digitizing this material, we're actually trying to save history. In my PowerPoint that I put together, I have some examples. All of the recordings that I had, all of these reel-to-reel recordings that I had, were actually pretty decent. There were a handful that were barely audible, and even after enhancing them, they were barely audible. I want to tell you, though, in your audience, there was one recording, and it was a radio interview, and it was really a good one, from, I think, the 1950s, 57 or 58. And it's a radio host interviewing UFO witnesses from the surrounding area of what they had observed. I started the recording on the computer, and I threaded the tape through the machine. And I'm sitting here and I'm writing, and I suddenly start to see things flying on my paper. As the magnetic head hit the tape, once it crossed over the magnetic head, the magnetic strip was delaminating from the vinyl backing. In other words, as it was playing, it was disintegrating.
It was destroying it.
Hopefully you hit record.
That's why I said, luckily I hit record beforehand, because sometimes I would run them through just to get an idea, and then I would run them back through. This one I hit record, but the point is, and I have a picture of this, it looks like magnetic confetti all over my desk.
Wow.
And all over the tape player. I had one shot at getting it digitized, and I got it. But
oh wow, man!
It was a pile of magnetic confetti, and I have examples of the papers that we have. Many of these news clippings were glued onto pieces of paper circa 1950, 1960. Well, back then they used acid-based glue. The acid has actually bled through, and in some of the news clippings, you can't even read them anymore. It's completely darkened them. And other ones used a chemically treated type of paper in the 1940s and 50s. Some of those literally corroded. It looks like battery acid corrosion. And not only did it destroy that document, but I have an example in my PowerPoint showing the corroded document and one that was filed next to it. And it also destroyed the neighboring document. So the point I'm bringing up is it's so important to preserve this material, because some of these may be one-of-a-kind interviews. Some of these may be one-of-a-kind documents. And once they're gone, they're gone.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of
especially on an analog format. Like that stuff only has so much of a shelf life before it's no longer any good, before the elements just eventually, unless it's in a controlled environment.
Absolutely.
It's just, I think time is just going to destroy those things.
And I will tell you, you were talking about research being boring, and it is boring. It's tedious. And
it's supposed to be.
And I will tell you, going through these files, the dust and the mold, and even some of the recordings had mold on the spool where they were initially stored at one time. And as I'm playing these, I found that my sinuses were flaring up and I'm sneezing my head off. And my wife kept coming in and she's like, "Are you getting sick?" I'm like, "No, it's this damn mold from these tapes." Because as the tape's playing, it's just dispersing the mold into the air. And so,
no, I'm just breathing poisonous
biological
air
effect.
Might kill me.
I think I'm going to start calling it like UFO archaeology. You know, you have to dig through the dust and the mold to get to the data.
We got a $20 super chat question here from Skyhawk. He says, David, after your 2013 book, we talked about historical mentions of triangles. The November 1931 Wonder Stories tetrahedra of space. Yeah. You believed it was the oldest you knew of at the time. Have you since then found one older?
I think that is still the oldest one, to be quite honest with you. Yeah, and that was an interesting graphic on the cover of that novel or novelette, I guess you would call it. But no, I think that's the earliest one I have. One of the earliest accounts, though, that I documented in my book was from 1882. And by the way, this you asked about if I've made a mistake. Here's a mistake I made. I quoted the works of Charles Fort in my book, and I referenced a case from 1882. which Fort alluded to. But Fort would often get his volumes and numbers mixed up and dates. I had a digital copy of the article, but I didn't have the original Scientific American from 1882. I now have an original bound issue, which I located, the original from 1882. I didn't realize that the volume number and edition number was from January of 1882, and it describes a sighting that occurred in April. So obviously it was April 1881.
Right.
So I'm a year off. Forgive me.
No, that's okay. That's
There's
okay.
an example of where I made a judgment based on the data that I had. But the point I was going to bring up is 1881 in Connecticut, they described astronomers seeing two black triangular notches moving towards each other over the lunar surface. And what's interesting is I found a case from the 1950s in Korea where at a U.S. Army military post, they looked up and they saw two black objects. One went by and it crossed. The moon was here. They saw the black triangle move like this. And a few minutes later, they saw another black triangle moving in the same direction.
Wow.
And I thought that was kind of interesting.
That is interesting. We had another question here from SDK 4422. What does David think about craft being made out of nanomaterial? And that's the reason why they change shape. Of course, this is pure speculation, but we have
it's
fun.
I mean, to your point, I don't like to mire myself in speculation like many researchers and enthusiasts do, because at some point, in absence of evidence, we have to speculate, right? But hopefully it's predicated on facts or patterns in the data. And no, I think this SDK 4422, I think that's a great point. I mean, we're already starting to look at nanomaterial, nanotechnology, whatever these things are, whether man-made or otherwise. I think the ability, if these accounts are true, the ones where they seem to be morphing or changing shape, I think we have to look at that, or we're looking at some aspect of dimensional space as we know it. I mean, who knows? But there are some really good ones. There's a case from 1954, British overseas airway cruiser piloted by a Captain Howard was flying, and for 15 minutes, they saw this array of UFOs. They saw this one main black object that looked like an old-fashioned telephone receiver upside down at one point. And then it took on a slightly different appearance. And then at one point it took on a triangular appearance. And it was flanked on both sides with 3 black dots on each side, separate objects that seemed to be flying in tandem with this thing. But it followed them for like 15 minutes. The pilot, the co-pilot, the stewardess, and I think about 50 passengers were observing this. And they very clearly saw this thing apparently morphing or changing shape. And then Lee Boyd was the first officer on the flight. In the newspaper accounts, and this got a lot of publicity, so we have lots of documentation on it. Captain Howard looked away. He was checking his instrumentation, and he looked back where the UFOs were, and he asked Lee Boyd, the first officer, what happened to the smaller ones? He only saw the main parent object, if I can use that term. He said, it looked like they went into the large one. And we have other accounts of triangles with lights or objects going in and detaching from the triangle. There's a case over Brohyr, Denmark. And this is one that I found digitally online, and then I was able to trace it back to the Blue Book files. It involved a triangular object, black silent triangle, hovering over the village of Brohyr in April of 1958. And the Reuters news service interviewed the woman, and in the article, they stated that at least 20 other villagers said they saw the same thing. And they interviewed one of the astronomers with the Danish Interplanetary Society, I think it was the name, and he stated that they've been plagued with accounts of triangular spaceships, was the exact quote in the article. Wow. I found it in Blue Book also, going through Hynek's files. I have in fact, I think I've got it right here. I'll share it with you and your audience. Here it is. So there's Hynek's actual Blue Book record card on the case.
Wow.
Cool.
That is pretty cool.
And in the account there, you can see that the woman described horseshoe. This isn't the best account. This is kind of choppy. They try to fit it on the record card, but in the Reuters News Service article, it talks about horseshoe-shaped objects that were seen coming out of the triangle. Each one was emitting a strong light. But this is Hynek's actual record card from his Blue Book file.
Wow. It looks delicate.
They're actually in pretty good condition overall.
Yeah.
But in previous lectures, I would cite this case, and I had this grainy, terrible photocopy from like the National Archives. And then going through the files, I'm like, I got to look to see if he has it. And then sure enough, I had a nice, pristine, original copy from Blue Book. And just to give you an idea, just some of the things we do have, we even have a Sign of the Times, Western Union telegrams talking about UFO sightings.
Yeah.
So
Wow,
as I like to say,
Yeah.
these are the emails of the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah. Well, I always, there's always this, and I feel like it's just the older generation. This always happens with older generations. Well, in my day, we would never be looking at a device all day. It's just like, you go back and look at pictures from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, especially in big cities where people take public transit to work. Their nose is in a newspaper. Everyone's nose is looking down in a newspaper. So it's just funny.
Well, something I'm so glad you brought that up, Luis, because you find interesting observations as you're going through the hundreds of case files that I've been pouring through for the last year. I found it interesting that we have a lot of reports from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And it was mainly due to the fact that the person stepped outside with the dog so they could have a cigarette.
Yeah.
And now we have a lot fewer people smoking. So you have to wonder, how many UFO sightings did we lose just because people weren't out there
stopped smoking? Oh my God. I never, ever thought about that. You are one. I mean, there are literally millions of people that are not smoking today that if this was 1980 would definitely have been outside.
And many of these reports, the people will state, there was one gentleman, he worked for a radio station. I think it was in Ohio. He said, during the commercial break, I stepped out on the roof to have a cigarette during the break. And I looked up and I saw a triangle. And then there's other people that say they stepped out in their farm or their backyard and they were just admiring the stars so they could enjoy their cigarette before they went to bed.
Yeah.
And so how many UFO sightings have we lost in a combination of fewer smokers and now people have smart devices where they're looking down?
Yeah, damn it. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I kind of want everybody to go back to smoking again.
I'm not encouraging that.
Yeah. So Mr. Badger had a question, but you kind of already answered this. So I'm going to recommend Mr. Badger to go back and listen to the conversation. But it was, why do you choose to focus on triangles rather than shapes, other shapes, unusually shaped craft in general?
Well, real quick, if I could just touch on the question, I didn't mention this earlier. When I was putting together my historical data, I was seeing a lot of people online making comments, and you still see it to this day, unfortunately, despite my book. And now with this new data I'm going to be presenting this year, I saw a lot of people making comments online or social media. Well, these triangles are new, therefore they must be military. It's like, okay, if I can take the first part of your argument and cut the legs out of it, it's like, I'm not saying it might not be military, but you can't use the argument because they're new, they're military, because clearly they're not. I mean, one of the contemporaneous reports.
One of the things that documentary by J.J. Abrams was trying to, this is one of, I think James Carrion's arguments or somebody in there had said, one of the skeptics was like, well, what, especially during the 70s and we had these UFO flaps with triangles, what was going on in the 70s around 1977? Star Wars. Death Stars. It's just like, okay, maybe those count some of the things people are seeing, but I don't think Star Destroyers was the thing that set off the triangle.
No. Luis, I'm so glad you brought that up, because earlier when I was talking about this new historical research I've been engaged in over the last year, I said I went from 47 to 77, and there's a reason I stopped. I'm using that exact statement. It was by David Clark in the UK in the Unidentified episode I was in. And he made the comment. In fact, I think I've got his quote here. He said, pardon me, he goes, from the 1970s onwards, you get this increasing trend of people to see giant triangular objects or wedge-shaped objects. And he goes, he thinks the easiest place to look for an answer is popular culture. And the film I remember seeing from childhood, which had a huge triangular shape or wedge shape, was the very first Star Wars film. When that was released, 1977. And then he goes on to say, strangely enough, this is the same period of time that people started seeing this huge dark triangular shaped objects. And I use that statement to prove him wrong by pulling these contemporaneous reports from the 1950s. Because in that same episode, I said, and for the benefit of my audience, I talk about this. I will be talking about this. Prior to him saying that, you heard me say in the 1960s and 70s, there was a massive increase in triangular UFO reports. So obviously those statements contradict each other. Somebody's right, somebody's wrong.
Right.
And I don't know what they are, but all I can tell you is he's wrong, I'm right, because I have history.
That's about as definitive as I've heard you today, sir.
Yeah. I mean,
that's cool.
It just, so it bothers me though, when people make statements that again, you can say that, you can believe that, the evidence suggests otherwise.
Right.
Yeah, it's easy to treat something as a silver bullet when it is not.
Yeah, exactly.
Brian McDonald with a $50 super chat. Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Marler, how do you feel about the sale of the MUFON data? Does MUFON retain the rights to that data? And what are you drinking, Jazz? High Tide? Oh my God. Okay, so I don't know if you know this about the show. Oh, there you go, Pellegrino. Anytime there's a $50 super chat, Jazz usually is on the show and he'll take a shot. And so I'm sure he's watching. If not, that one's for you, Jazz. I appreciate it. But yeah, what do you think about the MUFON data being sold?
And just for clarity, what data are we talking about?
That's a great question. I'm not sure because I wasn't aware.
James Carrion was, and in the UFO or the HBO documentary, was talking about selling the MUFON data to the government.
Oh, okay.
I am fine with if they're selling information, and I'll explain why. But I think the devil's in the details. Are they giving these case reports and case files lock, stock, and barrel? Because I can tell you, one of the things that we're concerned about getting these files online is we have to go through and redact any names, addresses, phone numbers if the witness back in the time said, I wish to remain anonymous, or I don't want my name used publicly. Even though these people are probably long since dead from the 40s or the 50s, we're still going to honor that. I would hope that MUFON, in the sale of those files, would redact any of that information, because I think, you got to respect the witnesses. They were kind enough to file a report, and if they don't want their name used publicly, then you need to ensure that. So as long as they're doing that, and the reason I say that is, I continue to share information with Chris Mellon because I think Chris Mellon knows people that might be interested in the data. I will share my data with anyone. If Mick West, a skeptic, wants to look at my data, I will share my data with Mick West. Again, as I alluded to earlier, I don't want to sound hypocritical. The more eyes and brains that we have to bear on the subject, the better. Different perspectives, I think, can yield some interesting results. I'm collecting the data, but my opinion is not the be all end all. I'll be the first to say that.
And we appreciate that. And Mick actually does watch the show from time to time. Anytime his name's mentioned, he somehow his ears ring and he somehow shows up. But yeah, I think Mick West right now is working on a 3D rendering, I think, of the camera systems that were on the on these jets, and he's adamant that this glare is a rotation from the camera, and other people are saying no, it's the rotating thing is the craft itself, and he's like, all right, well, let's put this into a 3D engine and see what it says. And I gotta love him for it. I mean, he's relentless with it, and usually he ends up being right.
Right. Well, all I can say is ufology should be no different than a court of law if you're dealing with a criminal case. You don't go into that courtroom with the intent that I know that guy's guilty. I haven't even seen him yet. I don't even know the details, but I know the guy's guilty. You don't go in like that. You go in with an open mind. You try to be objective. You try to weigh the evidence, and then you formulate a judgment. That's how we should be with the UFO subject. And that's what I've tried to do, is at least, in fact, Barry, a friend of mine up in Denver, Colorado, which I'll be I'll be doing this lecture virtually. My first time, to get kind of a dry run for Colorado MUFON. It'll be a virtual, so if anybody's interested, they can go to my website and get the details on that if they'd like to see some of this material in greater detail. But Barry remarked, I sent him my PowerPoint. He goes, "Wow." He goes, I forget the exact words he used, but he said, "You're like the Perry Mason of ufology." You're coming in and presenting your case.
I love it. I hope most of our audience gets that Perry Mason reference.
Old reference.
It's an old one, but I know who that is. Okay, so I'm gonna get to. We got a couple more questions. We're running out of time, but let's see if we can get to all of them. So the Sparky Lady writes, David and UCR team, I've really enjoyed all the questions and answers today. Thank you. You're absolutely welcome. Thank you for the donation. Josh and Artemis with a $4 super sticker. Thank you. Paul Vidal with a $20 question asks, many thanks to UCR and David Marler for your work. Do you share the sentiment that understanding of UAP must come from the focus on specific subjects like triangle UFOs in this case and other phenomena rather than wild speculation?
Well, wild speculation, I don't subscribe to. Whether it's politics, religion, or UFOs, wild speculation doesn't impress me. Like I said, I really like the lead in though that we discussed as far as what Rather brought up, in the sense that we can look at a subset of data, but we can't be too stringent to the exclusion of all else. Right. I've always felt this way. I've never had any grandiose idea that I'm going to crack open the UFO mystery and solve it, or that anyone else in my lifetime probably will. The way I kind of look at it, I try to take a pretty pragmatic approach. Looking at a particular aspect of the phenomenon, whether it's a type of object or electromagnetic interference cases or, abductions, if you really drill down and you try to look at a subset of data, because admittedly, if we take all of this and throw it against the wall, it's like a Jackson Pollock painting. It just looks chaotic, random, and just crazy. Good luck trying to make sense out of that. I think we do need to take certain aspects of the phenomenon and try to break it down, and so in doing so, the only hope that I have is that, and I think I've done this with my book, we could at least find insights with regard to patterns in the data. That's not an answer. But those patterns may be a stepping stone to take us to the next level, which may not be the answer, but yet we'll continue to build a case and we can get gradual insights. Louise, I think you said, you're hoping that people temper their expectations. There's not going to be an immediate reward. It's going to take time. It's going to be slow. It's going to be deliberate. And, certainly this is just one aspect of the phenomenon, and there's many other aspects, but and again, I don't want to put blinders on where we're only looking at triangles, but it's a starting point. That's how I view it. And that if we see that there do appear to be consistency, it's suggestive, not conclusive, suggestive that there could be a genuine phenomenon here. And I obviously feel that there is somewhere in the data. I don't think this is all just lies and just, I find it interesting that especially in the 50s and 60s and even 70s, before triangular UFOs were even widely known, we have consistent reporting of these things. If you were going to concoct or fabricate a UFO story to get an aha on the local UFO investigator, you would probably draw that story along lines that they're used to hearing. Oh, I saw a 30-foot silver disc, had a little dome on top, and I heard a humming noise, and my car engine stalled. Yeah. That's not what some of these people were reporting. They were reporting, for the first time in their minds, a large triangle with lights on each corner, moving silently, blocking out the stars, just skirting the treetops. And so I find that to be interesting as well. These stories back in that day go against the grain of what the stereotypical imagery was.
And I don't mean to extend this conversation, but it made me think of a question. What do you think about Christopher Mellon's sort of theory that these things are mapping out, or what looks like to be mapping out the terrain on the planet in the way that they move? It's almost like a one of those carpet cleaning machines,
No, I have to tell you, originally when I was writing my book, I was of the mindset that perhaps, again, we have to speculate at some point based on evidence, based on information. I thought that the lights may be an inherent part of the propulsion technology. In other words, imagine if you had a three-sided table, short of having a center post where it's hovering. If you wanted to kind of have this thing maintaining a horizontal position, you would locate some type of lift element on each point.
Right.
But the further I continued to do my research, and even in my book, some of the data didn't fit with that idea. And then with the subsequent data I've been collecting, it totally argues against that, because many of these triangles have no lights, completely devoid of light.
Right.
And unidentified, they recreated one where they showed no lights on it. It was just this silent triangle moving along. So it's like, okay, if you turn the engine off, it's not going to stay in the air. And
Right.
so I think Chris is onto something, especially as he pointed out. You take those 3 data points where you're able to triangulate, but also it speaks to the nature of how these things are low. I always used to think they flew low like we do in the military, just to fly under radar. But perhaps it's to get close to the surface area that, to your point, Luis, that you're possibly mapping. And then you combine that with the erratic maneuvers that I've documented in many of these cases. Whereas in the Utah case, the witness saw the object going back and forth like a grid search.
Right.
You couple all those things together, and it is speculation, but I think it's a logical speculation to think, is it charting or mapping something? And so I think Chris might be onto something.
I'm dying to get Chris on this show. I'd love to talk to him, because there's a lot of questions we have for him. Bottled water, the $20 donation. Some people seem to forget that the F-22 program started in 1981, didn't fly 10 years later, and took over a decade to become operational. But yeah, we have our own UFOs since the 70s.
No, absolutely. I mean, it takes a long time before we know about these craft. But again, if we go from 1950 to 2022, that's a huge period of time. I would think we would know about these craft by now if they were ours, at least from that era.
Mostly Space had this question, and then 2 minutes later, you basically answered it. And it was exactly in reference to the Scientific American from the early 1800s. So then she put in they put in another question saying, my last super chat came up 2 minutes after I sent it, LOL. So here's another. Are you familiar with the advanced dirigible hypothesis from the Phoenix Lights?
Yeah. I've heard a lot of different theories and speculation regarding.
What is this? Because I haven't heard this.
Well, just the idea, I believe what they're alluding to is that it was just this large, lighter than air vehicle that was illuminated that traversed the area. I don't know. I'm always the first to tell people I did not personally investigate the Phoenix Lights case. I know people who investigated it, so I can't speak from firsthand investigative experience on that case. It seems like the object moves slowly for the most part, which is indicative of maybe a blimp or a dirigible. And I even have said that with some of these triangle cases, but it's the ones that where it's hovering and then suddenly it rapidly accelerates away. That is suspicious. I'm very suspicious of that. Other people described that they saw lights that were recessed inside this object, inside this structured vehicle. I guess you could possibly do that with a blimp or dirigible. I honestly don't know. The sheer size of it, though, is what really staggers the imagination. If the estimates are close to true, and I think they are, because we had so many witnesses spread out over such a large area, because witness testimony is very bad when it comes to gauging size and distance. But this object, I mean, you had witnesses at this location saying it's directly overhead, witnesses over here saying it's directly overhead, and you can estimate the distance. Even if it was a lighter than air vehicle, this thing was immense. So, where did it originate from, and where did it terminate its flight? That's what I would like to know.
Rather, did you have any last questions for Mr. Marler before we let him go?
Yeah, my head's just spinning with all this information. I don't know if I have any more, but gosh, it was a really exciting, fun chat.
No, thank you. And like I said, hopefully some people might be able to attend my virtual lecture here in February.
Well, I'll tell you what, when the virtual lecture comes up, please do not be afraid to just let us know.
Sure.
And we'll be more than happy to talk about it and share the link on the show. If you want to come back and tell people about it, just if you want to stop by for 10 minutes and be like, hey, this weekend I'm doing this. Let me know. Just give us a buzz, and anybody in the area, hopefully could come out and make it. I know we do have some fans in the New Mexico area, so
absolutely.
I do have one last question for you, David.
Oh, here we go. Rather,
what's the best way to get your book?
The best way is it's on Amazon, but there's an old link that a lot of people get directed to, or it says it's not available. if you go to my website again, www.davidmarlerufo.com, scroll down the main page. I made sure that the valid link is there to take you to the Amazon site. Absolutely great. Thank you for mentioning that, Rather.
Okay, well, Mr. Marler, that was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, no, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I just love that, like, all of my other favorite researchers in this field come to the table with, hey, here's what I got. This is the data I'm looking at. I'm not telling you what it is or what I think it is, but here's what I do know. Something is there. Yeah, this is not just hearsay. There is a diamond in the rough. There is a there. There is a rarity to this element, to this phenomenon that is real. And I wonder if the Phoenix Lights happen in 2022, what that would look like.
I've always said that's what we need an event the size and scale of Phoenix Lights happening today, because we have our smartphones now.
Yeah, and yes, I would. Who knows? Fingers crossed. Knock on wood. I hope it happens. David, thank you so much for stopping by. Again, before you get out of here, you're not on Twitter, are you?
I am not. I do not tweet.
Okay.
Wise man.
Might be wise moves, sir. Yeah, because I was looking for you because I wanted to tag you in this, but yeah,
I barely have time to keep up on Facebook in the interest of full disclosure.
I hear you. Well, again, sir, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to do it again.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
All right, sir. We'll see you soon. And again, if you want to check out David's website, the link is in the description below. Until next time, David, we'll see you soon. Thank you for stopping by.
Good. Thank you.
All right, sir. Ciao.
Thanks.
Woo, that was fun, man.
That was
people like that.
Great discussion. Yeah, I love his pragmatic approach. He just has a great attitude for this field.
Yeah, and is just civil about it, which is nice.
Smart. It has a lot of information.
After the day I've had today, it was a nice spoonful of civility. It was quite scrumptious to chew on that. So special thanks to him. Rather, do you have anything coming up on the channel this week you want to talk about?
Man, I've been still researching Gary Nolan's talk about metamaterials and specifically the Council Bluff, Iowa event. Trying to put all my thoughts together and hope to get a new video out within a week.
Well, I'm hoping to have on Deep Prasad on the show pretty soon. I talked to him on Twitter today, and he seems interested in stopping by again. So maybe I would love to get Deep and Gary, and also the gentleman who interviewed them for the alchemy. I'm forgetting the name of the podcast that he was just on, but he's doing amazing work. Whoever that guy is.
Yeah, for sure.
The alchemist or something like that. Anyway, all right, you guys, before we get out of here, of course, I want to say thank you to DOS Tapes. They provide all the music you hear on the show. Their Bandcamp link is in the description below. Want to say thank you to everyone who sent to Super Chats. Truly appreciate it. I hope we got to all your questions, and also to some of the questions of people who didn't have Super Chats. I hope we got most of yours in there. To everyone in the chat, thank you for so much for coming by, hanging out with us. Before we get out of here, of course, if you can, like, share, subscribe. There was over 200 of you guys in here today. So if you all do that, it helps the show grow big time. If there's any way that you can find it in your room of your life to check out our Patreon for as little as $1 a month, you can help support the show. We're a public access channel. We run on viewers like you, so we truly appreciate every dollar we get. It is an absolute honor to serve you guys with this show. And check out our archive. It's free. You can totally check out every show we've ever done for free in our archive. This show will be available on podcast, Spotify, iTunes as soon as the show is over. So leave us a rate and review there. Want to say thank you to Jane. Want to say thank you to Rather, Michael, everyone who's not here. Daniel Miller show tomorrow. He's going to be coming back next weekend, and I think that's his last show. And then we're going to be talking about possibly new ideas to do stuff for Tuesday, and that will involve heavily the people who watch this show. So stay tuned for details on that. And that's it, you guys. I appreciate all of the love, all of the hate, everything that you guys throw our way. We love it. Until next time, thank you so much for coming aboard, getting weird with us here on another episode of the Unidentified Celebrity Review, your home for credible news, reviews, and commentary on everything UAP and UFO. My name's Luis Jimenez. Rather be squitting. Say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Excellent job. We'll see you next time, you guys. Much love and peace. Ciao. I'm going to tell y'all right now, all of these wonderful people would not be here without Patreon supporters like you. If you enjoy credible news, reviews, and commentary on UFOs and UAPs 5 days a week, you want to support this show. What's your name? Marty. Marty, look how easy this is, Marty. Pick up your phone. Boom! You're a Patreon member. I mean, look, it's so easy. You just click the link, which is right here. Just for $1 a month, you can support this show. Just fill out the information and pledge what's comfortable for you. It could be $1, $5, $10, or who knows. Just support.
Thank you.